Welcome to this tutorial in which I will show you how to use the Camera Projection Toolkit. So let's get started. First thing is to download the plugin and unzip it into your project plugins folder. Like so. Plugins and paste it. Okay. Of course, make sure that the version of the plugin that you picked is matching the engine version that you're using. And then launch the project. Okay, once you're launched, you can quickly check in your plugins that the Camera Projection Toolkit is indeed active. Yes, it is. Another quick way to make sure that it is on is if this button shows up in your toolbar. Next, I'm gonna open a level of mine that contains a bunch of assets, a bunch of cameras and lights and so on. Now, to get started using the toolkit, you're gonna open the widget by clicking this button. This is gonna show this UI, which is really just a helper to manipulate the different paths of the toolkit. The first thing to do when you've opened like a fresh level on which you want to start working on is to click Initialize. And this is going to prompt you for creating that projection layer asset. You're going to say yes. Great. Now you initialize. There's a bunch of things that happened. The first thing is that you should see the name of your currently open level in here, which is the case here. It's matching the same name. Great. The second thing is that you should see now a blueprint called the Camera Projection Collector being added to your level. And clicking this button is a quick way to select it, by the way. And if you delete, if for some reason it got deleted, clicking this button will re-import it again. And finally, the projection layer got created in the same folder as your level, inside that folder here, which is named just like your level with a suffix CPT. So if I go in there, you see that that's a projection layer on which we'll tweak parameters later on. So to show you the relationship between the camera collector and the projection layer, I'm just going to open both side by side. And you'll notice that, both of them have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 slots, which are corresponding to one another. The idea behind the projection collector is that you can pick a camera and stream its data to the material live so that you can do, live adjustments and everything should work in editor. But before that, you need to do another step, which has to do with all the materials that are being used in your level. So this master material tab here is listing every master material that is currently being used in your level. So it's a quick way to just make edits to master material. And the reason for that is because you need to add this projection layer to the master material that you want to project on. But let me show you a little trick. You can select the objects that you want to project on by hitting Control and Alt. By the way, I don't want to project onto the back wall. I don't want to project on the camera. Let's say I don't want to project on this object too. And then you can hit that button. And what this button does is that it's going to look at every object that you have selected and then select the corresponding master materials being used on them. It's quite handy because then you don't have to add the layer to everything in your scene. You can just be more selective about what you edit. Once you have the master material that you want to add the layer to, you can just click Add Layer. What this will do is that now if you open every one of those by double clicking, you will see that a new node has been added here. And it's referencing our projection layer asset. Great. Save. So now you are ready to project. So let's grab the camera collector and let's pick a camera onto that we want to use as a projector. So I'm going to pick projection, CineCamera Projection 0. And all of a sudden you can see that something's happening. So this is projecting the default texture because that's what's set by default in the material. So on to the slot 0. You have a bunch of options here. Let's start with the texture. The texture is really just using a base texture that comes with the plugin, which is quite handy when you are trying to see what's happening because it has a bunch of information here. Exposure is just a way to deal with the brightness. So this is a value in stops. So -1 is like half the light. -2 is half of that, and so on. So I'm going to set it to -3 or -4 so that you can see the texture a bit better. Then on to the masking options. So the first thing is pretty self-explanatory. Opacity. When set to 1 is completely opaque, and when it's below 1, it's going to start becoming transparent. Okay. Distance is just a way to clip the range of the projection. So you can set it to a minimum value or a maximum value. I can show you quickly. So this is Unreal unit, so that should be 350 centimeters. Yeah. There you go. So now I'm clipping how far I'm projecting. The fade is pretty self-explanatory. If you set it to a very small value, you should now like sort of have this clipping effect. Okay. On to the angle masking. Super useful. What this does is it's only going to project onto the faces of your object that are sort of pointing to the camera. So if I look through the camera, you see that everything that is at grazing angle is now being ignored. And the angle mean and angle max can let you deal with the range of that. And finally, the edge mask, which is just going to give you a fade from the camera point of view. So I think the larger the value, the more fade you have. There you go. Okay, let's do something a little bit more interesting now. So I'm gonna turn on the angle masking, and the edge mask. Great. One thing to note is that you may have to apply and save the projection layer in order to see changes. Sometimes it kind of depends on what you've ticked on and off, but yeah, make sure you've compiled your layer. Okay, back to the camera collector. There is this option here to turn the entire projection on and off, which is a nice way to see before after projection. Now, something I've done to show you a little example is I rendered this view from the camera to disk, and then I did an upres. So I added more detail to it. So this is the original render, and I created this image with like tons of detail, like a higher resolution, everything. And the idea behind that is to reproject that texture onto my assets. So let's try just that. I'm going to take that texture, put it in the texture slot, make sure my camera collector is active. And all of a sudden you can see that I'm projecting something that is now matching the geometry, which is great. It's exactly what I want. But the way I intended this was not necessarily to reproject the image one-to-one. What I want is to reproject only in the color of my materials. This is too dark because I exposed it down. So let's set the exposure correctly. Where's that? So that's the original. That's the reprojected one. Okay. And in order to do that, so in order to project not on top of everything, but just in the color, I'm going to use that option here that's called project in base color, which is pretty self-explanatory as well. Great. So now I'm not overriding all the lighting of my scene, and I'm really just adding detail to the color. I can show you a little before, after. So yeah, that's a little, that's an example of a workflow you could use, and you could, use to sort of enhance the look of a scene by doing a bunch of render, then place some cameras in ways that make sense, and etc., etc. But yeah, let's add a second camera now. So I'm gonna place a new camera in the slot number 1. Right. There you go. Nothing shows up. Okay, why? This is because by default the projection layer is only on for the 0 slot, so you have to take this on in order to see something. So keep in mind, this comes in 2 parts. It comes, you first have to set the projection camera on the BP, and then turn it on onto the projection layer. The reason I'm showing you that is to show you the layer stack. So projection 1 is always going to be on top of projection 0, and so on. So if I add another camera and then they both overlap, projection 2 will be on top of projection 1, which is on top of projection 0. And another nice little trick is to pilot your cameras to place them live in the viewport, like so. And you can see here I'm seeing the lighting because I'm only projecting in the color, in the base color. Great. One other thing I would like to show you is that the plugin does work in Plane Editor, and will work as well when you use a movie render queue to render a scene. Of course, you need to have the BP, your master materials that contain the BP, sorry, the projection layer, and the master materials that contain that projection layer in order for all to work. Now I'm going to move on to another example. Let's open this new level. Sure, save. Okay, new scene. So I am going to initialize this level. I'm going to create the projection layer. I'm going to set the slot 0 to this camera here that I prepared. I'm going to do that little trick of selecting all the master material on which all the objects I want to project onto. I don't want the wall. I don't want the water. I'm going to select them, and then I'm going to hit add layer. Okay. And now I want to show you how to project not just through the camera point of view, but onto the entire scene. So at 100 and at 360 degrees. The way to do that is to use whether Latlong map or a Cubemap. Let's start with the Latlong. Great. So the moment I tick that, it's going to change internally the type of projection I'm doing, and it's now going to project all around the scene. And if you look at the format of the texture it's using, it's a Latlong texture. So for those of you who don't know what a Latlong texture, it's an equi-rectangular texture, which is 2:1 ratio and projects 360 degrees here and 180 degrees vertically. Let's go back to the projection layer. There is support in the material for linear texture, which are not sRGB, which is very helpful when you're using HDRIs, for instance. The moment you tick this, you're gonna need to drag and drop a texture of you that is linear. So that's Latlong format. The third mode, sorry, is the Cubemap. So if you tick Cubemap, you'll see that now it's not a regular texture that's being used. And by the way, you can see all the type of textures that the plugin requires or works with in the texture folder of the plugin. So you can see that once I ticked Cubemap, now it's using a texture cube texture, which is internally it's really just the 6 faces of a cube, which is just an unreal way to do cube maps. So you can see, even though you're seeing it in a Latlong format here, you can see that it's actually 4K maps times 6. So that's another way to project all around. One thing to note is that if you are going to use virtual textures with the Cubemap mode, then the texture is going to change the format. It's not going to use a texture cube, but it's now going to use a virtual texture with UDIM tags. So for those of you who don't know, if you are importing UDIM textures in Unreal, they are automatically going to get converted to a virtual texture, and that's exactly what this mode expects. Let's use that for now. I'm going to expose it down. Go. Save. Great. Let's do a little bit of masking on top of that because it's a bit brutal. I want to project in the distance. Okay. Let's do a bit less, just for the sake of the example. And let's use the angle mask, which is very handy. Okay, save. If you go in the render folder of the plugin, there is this LevelSequence here that is set up to render each face of the cube for you, which is very useful if you plan to render from a point of view and then reproject through the Cubemap mode. So let's look through this angle here. I deliberately set my camera, my projection camera, to the same transform in space than the cube render, so you'll see exactly what I've rendered. This looks a bit dark, so let me expose this up. This stops. There you go. So if you look through this cube render camera, you see that every frame, every frame corresponds to one side of the cube. So the workflow from here is to render that sequence. Of course, you don't want to render with the base texture, so you will render every single frame here. Then you can do some sort of treatment to your textures and re-import them as virtual textures, which is exactly what I've done here. So I just added more detail to those views. And now I want to reproject them onto my entire scene. So I'm going to use that texture in my layer, like so. Of course, set it to active. I can quit the sequence, save. And now you can see I am reprojecting this cube map through the same camera onto my entire scene. And on and off. And by the way this was intended was to really be reprojected through the color of the material, because I want to retain the lighting. So let me change that to tick projecting base color. Looks a bit dark. Look at the inlet. Yeah, it's too dark. So the original base color looks like this. So I need to expose the texture up. Yeah, better. Let's save that. Go back to gate mode. And voila. So this is a nice and quick way to just add detail to an entire scene without having to place so many cameras. Before, after. That's it. That's the end of the tutorial. I will end up by showing you how to clear a level from everything that the toolkit creates. And that's really simple. You just need to hit the clear button here. Say yes, and this will remove the BP. This will remove the projection layer asset, and this will also clean up your master materials. Once this is done, you can just hit save and back to square one. All right. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully you can find some very nice uses to this plugin.